Okay, in this video, we're going to talk about myofilaments, so stay tuned. All right, let's look at what we have right now, and let's just orient you to what you're seeing on the screen right now. The picture on the left, this is going to be this whole structure here. This is going to be your muscle fiber. Okay. This structure here, you should know this. This is the myofibril. And the small structures right there, those are your myofilaments. Those are your myofilaments, and those are the structures that we're going to talk about in this video. So let's zoom in on those myofilaments and take a little bit closer look. So these myofilaments, let me just do one of these things, okay? That's going to be the structures that we're looking at down here. Now, the myofibril, okay, this full length, remember up here, the myofibril, or the muscle fiber is made up of multiple myofibrils. The myofibril is made up of multiple myofilaments. The myofilaments don't go the full length of the myofibril. In fact, there are many successive units that are laid back to each other that makes up the full length, okay? And just briefly, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but you can see this squiggly line here, and you see this little squiggly line here. The myofilaments are only in this spot, okay? Then you add another one. So you have another one on here. You had another successive one and another successive one. And if you glue them all together, that gives you your full length of your myofibril. In another video, we'll talk about what that squiggly line is. Right now, let's just talk about the myofilaments, okay? Myofilaments will come in two flavors. There's going to be a thick filament and a thin filament, okay? So looking at this picture here, the yellow, let me go here. The yellow is thick filament, that's an H, okay? And this one is thin, okay? So you can see the thin filament, and this is thicker. In fact, the thin filament is about half the size of your thick filament. The thick filament is called myosin. The thin filament is called actin. Okay, so you have a myosin protein. That's what, or myosin protein molecules make up the thick filament, and you have actin protein molecules that make up the thin filament. Okay, so let's look at the next thing. So let's look at the thin and thick filament a little bit better so we can see this. Okay. So we've just zoomed in on the thick and thin. This is going to be thick. So let me do thick. And this is thin. Okay. Do you recall what this name is? Think about it. Think about it. You should get myosin. Let me back that up. I don't need that there. So this is myosin. And then this one makes it actin. Okay. So first, let's look at your thick filament. Let's try this, okay? Your thick filament is not one protein molecule. In fact, it's made up of anywhere between 200 and 500 myosin protein molecules. So you can kind of see we have these lines here. These are just a whole bunch of myosin molecules kind of laying next to each other, okay? And each one of those strands, okay, or each myosin protein strand is made up of two regions, okay? This is the tail. And this is the globular head. Okay? So the tails, as you can see, they're twisted around each other. And the orientation of the tails, if we were to, let me go back to that one picture here, okay? If this is the center, and this is the outside edge, okay? Just to orient you on where that is. So the center, let's go back here. The tails here are pointing towards the center. So you're going to have some tails from this side pointing in, and then you have tails from this side pointing in. So this is going to be your center spot. Okay? The heads are pointing to the outside edge. Okay? Just so you can orient yourself on that one. Interesting things about the myosin head. Okay? So let me just erase this portion here real quick. Oops, I don't want to go all that far. Okay. So let's look at just the head itself. And you can see a couple other, where's my cursor? There we go. Okay, on the myosin head, those structures, you can see that little color area that's kind of a white, and then you can see a green area on those. Those are binding sites, meaning something is going to attach to that site. Now, let me get rid of that so you can see them. The top one, the top portion here, that is your actin binding site. In other words, that part of the myosin head is going to bind with a part of your actin filament. So therefore, it's the actin binding site. That green portion, this is a binding site for ATP. So this is going to be ATP binding site. Now, if you can recall from your previous biology classes, cells require ATP to do stuff. That's the chemical form of energy, okay? ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. It's a molecule of energy. So when you contract the muscle, that requires energy to be able to move the muscle, okay? And that comes from the ATP. You will go through this portion of it much more detailed in your physiology class. All right, so that's your myosin. And let's look at the actin here real quick. The actin is composed of two strands of actin protein molecules, okay? And you can see these strands are twisted around each other, okay? Unlike the myosin, where you have 200 to 500 strands, actin, you have basically two strands. Now, you can see this strand looks like almost like a string of pearls, brown pearls, okay? So each one of those things, this thing, those are called G-actin for globular, okay? Actin is the thin filament. Each strand, I'm just trying to go back. Each strand has about 300 to 400. So this is one strand going this direction. Then you have another strand going in that direction. Each one of those strands have 300 to 400 globular or G actin. Okay? And each one of those I'll just call them the pearls. Okay, each one of those are attached to a fibrous strand. Okay, think of like a string of pearls. You got a string that goes through them all. So each one of those G proteins are attached to an F protein or an F actin. Okay. Now each one of those G proteins, you can see underneath this green line here, you can see a little dark spot. Okay. Underneath that spot is your myosin binding site. Okay, so if you go back up, you have an actin binding site. Now we have a myosin binding site. Well, if you put the two together, then that tells you the actin binding site of this protein binds with the myosin binding site of this protein. Okay, so this is how muscles will start to contract, is when those two connect together and then the proteins slide across to each other. Okay. A couple other things that we haven't discussed is that green line. Okay, I tell you what, let me put this in green. Okay. This green, that's another protein called tropomyosin. Let me spell this out. Tropomyosin. Did I get that right? Yeah, that's tropomyosin. And this is a string-like protein that wraps around the actin fibers. And can you see on this picture how it kind of covers up the myosin binding site? Okay. So tropomyosin, when the muscle is at rest, tropomyosin, let me just do this, covers the myosin binding site. Okay? When it covers it, it prevents the myosin from attaching. That's all it's doing. Now the blue one, let me go to a blue color here. Okay, the blue complex that we're looking at, those structures, that's troponin. And troponin is attached to the tropomyosin. You can kind of see in the picture that it sits on top of it. Well, it's attached, the troponin is attached to the tropomyosin. The troponin, you can kind of see it's a dipped in area. That's a binding site. So let me go over here. So that little spot, and this is going to be a calcium binding site. Okay, so let's go through these again. This top picture here is myosin protein molecules. Each myosin protein molecule, or each one of those is made up to 200 to 500 myosin protein molecules or protein strands. Each strand is made up of a tail and a head, with two tails wrapped around each other or twisted around each other, and two globular heads. Each globular head has an actin binding site and an ATP binding site. The actin filament is the thin filament. It's made up of G proteins, or these globular actin, and there's 300 to 400 per actin strand. Each one of those G proteins has a myosin binding site. Okay, those G proteins are attached to the F actin, or it's the fibrous strand, and the actin are kind of twisted. Okay, wrapped around the actin strand is tropomyosin. And then the tropomyosin is covering up the myosin binding site. And when it's blocking that binding site, it's preventing the myosin head from attaching. attached to the tropomyosin is troponin. Troponin has a binding site for calcium. Now go back to the previous video. What stores calcium, or where's the reserve of calcium find? That's the terminal cisternae and the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Okay, the calcium is required for muscle contraction to occur. So that is a really quick view on actin and myosin. The next thing we want to do is cover the action potential and see how the electrical current propagates over the sarcolemma. Now again, we're touching in on physiology, so I'm going to just briefly discuss it. In physiology, you'll go through this much more detail. The reason I'm approaching it right now is because how that electrical current propagates across the sarcolemma or across a cell is going to be really important from this point on in anatomy and then in physiology. So if nothing else, I want you to start getting a good understanding of what this is. So stay tuned for the next video and we can rock it. Thanks.